The wind howled through the alley, carrying the stench of decay and despair. It was a night like any other, yet everything about it felt different. Maybe it was the weight of the past pressing against my ribs, or the way fate had arranged itself so perfectly before me 6 years ago. I had stood on the other side of this equation, shivering in the November cold, my breath forming desperate clouds in the air, as I begged my brother to reconsider. I had knocked on the locked door of my own home, the place our parents had left us, pleading for mercy from the only family I had left. But Marcus had simply watched from the window, his face set in cold indifference as he turned away, leaving me alone in the darkness. Tonight, it was his turn. I barely recognized him at first. The man slumped against the grimy brick wall was a shadow of the brother I had once known. His once arrogant posture was hunched, his fine features eroded by time, misfortune, and something deeper, defeat. His clothes were tattered, his skin sunken, and the cardboard sign in his shaking hands told a story of ruin. Hungry, homeless. Please help. My steps faltered for only a moment. Then I walked forward, slow and deliberate, letting my polished shoes click against the pavement so he would hear me approach. He looked up, and in that instant I saw recognition dawn in his eyes. The pride, the confidence, the smug superiority, gone, replaced by something raw. Shame. Ethan. His voice was barely above a whisper, hoarse from cold or disuse. Please, help me. I crouched down, making sure he could see me clearly, letting him take in the expensive suit, the tailored coat, the watch that cost more than what he had left in the world. I had spent years clawing my way out of the abyss he had thrown me into. And now, the wheel had turned. I reached into my wallet, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and folded it between my fingers. For a moment, I let myself feel something, anger, satisfaction, maybe even pity. Then I let the bill flutter to the ground between us. Consider this, Charity, I murmured, before standing up and walking away. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The past had finally settled its debts. But as I stepped into my waiting car, a thought gnawed at the edges of my mind. The story should have ended here, a perfect, poetic closure. And yet, something told me it wasn't over. Not yet. I expected to feel triumphant, to walk away from that moment with a sense of justice served, of balance restored. But as my car slid through the glistening streets of Manhattan, the city lights casting distorted reflections in the rain-streaked windows, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was unfinished. I had spent years imagining this encounter, the moment where I would stand above Marcus, looking down at the man who had taken everything from me, and deliver my final, cutting blow. I thought it would be enough. But now, hours later, sitting in my penthouse with a glass of whiskey untouched in my hand, I realized the truth. I had let him off too easy. Revenge wasn't supposed to be a single act. $100 bill dropped like a scrap to a begging dog. That wasn't justice. That was mercy. And Marcus had never shown me mercy. I remembered the nights I spent shivering in shelters, the smell of mildew clinging to every thread of borrowed clothing, the exhaustion that sank into my bones after endless shifts, washing dishes for pennies, the way people looked through me like I was invisible, the humiliation of being reduced to nothing, knowing the only person who could have helped me had chosen not to know. A single moment of humiliation wasn't enough. He had taken 6 years from me. I wanted more. The next day, I found myself standing across the street from where he had been the night before. He was still there, hunched against the wall like a forgotten piece of the city's wreckage. People passed him without a glance, their lives too full, too busy to acknowledge the man who had once walked among them. I watched him for a long time, Dot. Then I walked forward, Dot. This time, I didn't throw money at him. I crouched down again, watching his bloodshot eyes widen in disbelief. He didn't expect me to return. "You still have the nerve to ask for help?" I asked, my voice calm, almost curious, Dot. His throat bobbed as he swallowed, ashamed. I don't know what else to do." I let the silence stretch between us. Then I said, "Get up." Marcus hesitated. He must have been trying to figure out if this was some kind of sick joke, but there was something in my tone that made him obey. His movements were slow, stiff, as if he wasn't used to standing for long periods anymore. "Follow me," I said. Dot, he did. I didn't tell him where we were going. I just walked, and he trailed behind like a shadow. What began as a desperate desire to make Marcus pay for what he'd done had transformed. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming his dignity, his power, his life. He realized that true justice wasn't about destroying others. It was about finding peace within himself, regardless of what happened to the people who had wronged him. Marcus had spent years in a spiral of guilt and self-destruction, but his downfall had been self-inflicted. His greed, his manipulation, and his arrogance had led him to a place where the world was no longer his to command. Ethan had done what he needed to do, but now, watching Marcus from the sidelines as everything he had built crumbled, he felt nothing but cold, detached satisfaction. As for the people who had stood by Ethan through his darkest times, they were finally seeing him, not just as a victim, but as someone who had risen, no longer broken. The people who mattered, the friends he had made, the ones who helped him get back on his feet, now surrounded him, offering support, encouragement. They weren't there for the victory alone. They were there because they saw how much Ethan had changed, and how much he had overcome. Ethan had learned the game, and now he played it better than anyone. With his experience in real estate, he knew how to turn the tables. He had carefully orchestrated Marcus's downfall, using the same tactics Marcus had once used to hurt him. He had bided his time, gathering dirt, finding leverage, making sure he was the one in control when the moment arrived. Ethan had Marcus's financial frauds, his falsified documents, the illegal deals, the tax evasion, all of it in his hands. He didn't expose it all at once. No, he let Marcus live in the illusion of security, made him feel that the worst was behind him. Then, when the timing was perfect, he dropped the bomb. He sent the evidence to the media, the authorities, and to every single person in Marcus's life. Marcus thought he was untouchable, that his wealth and influence would shield him forever. But Ethan's meticulous planning brought him crashing down. The media frenzy was relentless. Marcus's company was investigated, his assets frozen, his reputation destroyed. The people he had once manipulated and used now turned their backs on him. Ethan watched it all unfold from a distance, a cool, calculating observer. Marcus's empire collapsed in an instant, and though it wasn't the revenge Ethan had once imagined, the angry confrontation, the power struggle, it was something far more satisfying. It was justice, in the purest form. In the end, Marcus didn't just lose his business. He lost everything. His friends, his family, his respect. His empire was gone, and he was left with nothing. The life he had built on betrayal was now a shadow, slipping through his fingers. Ethan didn't stay in New York City long after that. The air there had always been thick with memories of what he had lost. The city that had chewed him up and spat him out, no longer held the same meaning for him. He moved to a quieter place, somewhere far from the past. He became successful on his own terms, building a new life, one without the shadow of Marcus hanging over him. He found a quiet contentment in his new life, a balance that had once seemed impossible. He had finally made it, on his own. The woman he had been seeing, someone who had supported him throughout his journey, stood by his side. Their relationship was different from what he'd experienced before. It wasn't about the thrill of revenge or the need to prove something to the world. It was about mutual respect, understanding, and healing. The people around him had seen what he had gone through, and now they saw the strength he had built. Those who had once doubted him, those who had written him off as nothing but a victim of circumstance, now respected him. His success wasn't just about money. It was about the way he carried himself, the way he had turned his pain into power. But even as he moved forward, there was a lingering sense that the past was never truly gone. He was stronger now, but he wasn't free from the echoes of what had happened. And yet, he understood months later, as Ethan sat in his quiet apartment, sipping coffee. His phone buzzed with a message. He hadn't heard from Marcus in months, and he had no reason to expect anything from him now. But the message was brief. It was a single line. "I made a mistake, Ethan. I'll be paying for it for the rest of my life." Ethan didn't feel anger or satisfaction. Instead, he felt nothing. No triumph, no pity, no remorse. It was as if Marcus had finally acknowledged the consequences of his actions, but too late. Ethan glanced at the screen for a moment longer, then set the phone down and smiled. Not a smile of happiness, but one of peace. He wasn't the same person who had once been broken by betrayal. He had rebuilt himself, and he had nothing left to prove. He looked out the window, his gaze steady as he whispered to himself, "You made your bed, Marcus. Now lie in it." And for the first time in years, Ethan truly felt free. Something crucial. The past shaped him, but it no longer defined him. I could feel the stares of people on the street, noticing the contrast between us, the polished businessman and the ruined beggar at his heels. It must have looked absurd, Dot. When we reached a quiet cafe, I stepped inside and held the door open long enough for him to understand he was supposed to follow. The barista glanced at him warily, but I ordered 2 coffees without hesitation. When we sat down, I could see the way Marcus's hands trembled as he wrapped them around the cup, soaking in the warmth. Dot, for a long time. Neither of us spoke, Dot. Then, calmer finally, he asked, "Why are you doing this?" I leaned back, studying him. "Because I want to hear you say it," I said, Dot. His brows knitted together. "Say what?" "That you destroyed me." Marcus's grip tightened around the cup, and he looked away. I let the silence stretch again, letting the weight of the words sink in. I wanted him to feel it, Dot. The guilt, Dot. The shame, Dot. The realization that he was the reason for all of this. I wasn't done with him yet. Not even close. Marcus didn't answer right away. His gaze remained fixed on the cup, his fingers tightening around it as if he could draw strength from the warmth. I watched him struggle, watched the emotions flicker across his face. Shame, anger, maybe even regret. But regret wasn't enough, not for what he had done, Dot. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. He hesitated, licking his cracked lips. I didn't think it would end up like this. I let out a quiet laugh, shaking my head. You didn't think? I leaned forward, my voice sharp. You stole everything from me, Marcus. You forged those documents, manipulated the system, and threw me onto the streets like garbage. Don't sit here and tell me you didn't think. His eyes snapped up to mine, something flickering in them. Defiance? No, not quite. More like the remnants of the man he used to be. the one who had always been able to talk his way out of anything. But that man was gone. This version of Marcus was broken, and he knew it. I was selfish, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought I deserved it more. I thought you'd land on your feet. I exhaled slowly, feeling a bitter laugh bubble up. You thought I'd land on my feet. I gestured at him. Well, Marcus, looks like I did. And look where you landed. He flinched, his shoulders curling inward. He looked smaller now, like a man who had been eroded by life, whittled down to nothing but regret and empty hands. Good. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the moment stretch between us. I wanted him to sit in it, to marinate in his own failure, but I wasn't here just for that. No, I had something bigger in mind. I leaned forward again, lowering my voice. I have an offer for you. Marcus looked up, wary. You want a second chance? I asked. You want to crawl out of the gutter? His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. Yes, he said immediately. I smirked. Then you'll do exactly as I say. He nodded, too desperate to question it. He would have agreed to anything at that moment, and that was exactly what I needed. I leaned back, letting my words sink in. You work for me now. His brows knitted together. What do you mean? I mean, I own you, I said calmly. You'll do whatever I tell you. No questions, no complaints. You'll start from nothing. Just like I did. Minimum wage, the worst jobs I can find for you. And if you survive that, if you prove you're not worthless, maybe, just maybe, I'll throw you a real chance. I could see the conflict in his eyes. He hated the idea, hated the power dynamic, hated being at my mercy, but he also knew he had no other option. Finally, he nodded. Okay. I smiled. Good. Then let's begin. I stood up, tossing a few bills on the table for the coffee. As we walked out, I could feel the weight of his defeat in every step he took behind me. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The first job I gave Marcus was exactly what he deserved. Something degrading. Something that would strip away whatever scraps of ego he had left. I made a few calls and secured him a janitorial position at one of the lower-end properties my firm managed. It was a run-down apartment complex on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place where the walls were stained with water damage, the elevators barely functioned, and the tenants didn't care about the filth accumulating in the hallways. Marcus would be the one scrubbing those floors. The first day I drove him there myself. He sat beside me in silence, his body tense. I didn't speak either. There was no need. He had already agreed. He belonged to me now. When we arrived, I handed him a worn-out uniform and watched as he stared at it. His fingers curled around the rough fabric, and for a moment I thought he might throw it back at me. But he didn't. He just swallowed his pride and took it. Clock in at 6 every morning, I said, my voice businesslike. You'll clean the halls, the stairwells, the trash rooms, bathrooms too. No cutting corners. You'll report to the superintendent. And if you try to run, Marcus, I leaned in slightly, I'll make sure you don't have another chance. Ever. His jaw tensed, but he nodded. I get it. Good. I left him there, standing in the dimly lit maintenance room, dressed in a uniform that reeked of bleach and despair. It felt right. I checked on him after the first week. When I arrived at the complex, I found him in one of the stairwells, hunched over with a mop in his hands, his movements slow and clumsy. He looked exhausted, dark circles etched beneath his sunken eyes. Sweat clung to his forehead. and his once manicured hands were now rough with calluses. He barely glanced up when I approached. "Came to check if I quit yet?" I smirked, leaning against the railing. "Something like that." He sighed, wringing out the mop. "It's hell," he admitted. "But I'm still here." "Good," I said. "Then you're just getting started." I let him marinate in the misery for another month. No shortcuts, no special treatment. He lived in a crumbling studio apartment I arranged for him, barely more than 4 walls and a mattress on the floor. Every cent he made went toward rent and food. Nothing extra. He was living my past, and I wanted him to feel every second of it. But I wasn't done. Not yet. One evening, I called him into my office. He arrived in the same stained uniform, his shoulders slumped, his hands stuffed into his pockets. He was thinner now, more worn down. That entitled gleam in his eyes was long gone. I gestured for him to sit. He obeyed without a word. "You've survived longer than I expected," I said, watching him carefully. "Maybe you're not completely useless after all." He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "Is this the part where you tell me what's next?" I leaned forward. "I have another job for you." His gaze flickered with something unreadable. Fear, hope, I wasn't sure. "What kind of job?" he asked hesitantly. I smiled, slow and deliberate. "You're going to work in real estate." Marcus frowned. "I don't understand." "You will," I said. "But this time, you won't be the one taking. You'll be the one suffering." His lips parted slightly, confusion clouding his expression. And that's when I knew. He had no idea what I had planned for him next. But he would soon. I set Marcus up with the lowest job in my firm, one that required no skill, no respect, and no real trust. He was given a position as a door-to-door canvasser, the kind that involved knocking on cheap apartment doors and trying to convince desperate tenants to sell their units for insultingly low prices. It was the type of work no self-respecting real estate agent wanted, which was why we hired people like him, people with nowhere else to go. The first day, I handed him a clipboard with a list of addresses and a cheap suit that didn't fit him right. He looked at me like he wanted to argue, but he knew better by now. "This is where you start," I said, tossing the clipboard onto his lap. "You'll be dealing with the kind of people you once screwed over, the ones who can barely afford to keep a roof over their heads. You're going to walk into their homes, look them in the eye, and try to convince them to sell their last shred of stability for pennies." Marcus swallowed hard. "And if I don't?" I gave him a slow smile. "Then you go back to scrubbing toilets." I could see the war inside him, the humiliation, the bitterness. But he had no choice. He took the clipboard without another word. I checked on him after a few weeks. He had lost more weight. His suit, already ill-fitting, looked even looser on him. His skin was pale, his face drawn. But what caught my attention most was the way he carried himself. He no longer walked with the arrogant confidence he once had. Instead, his shoulders hunched slightly, as if expecting a blow at any moment. When he entered my office, he didn't meet my eyes. He stood there, waiting for whatever was next. "How's the job?" I asked, sipping my coffee. His voice was flat. "Terrible," I smirked. "Good." He exhaled, rubbing his temple. "You know, I've met people who remind me of you," he admitted. "People who were thrown out of their homes, tricked into selling by guys like me." His fingers clenched around the armrest of the chair. "I see what I did now, what it felt like for them. I leaned forward, studying him. And? He hesitated. Then finally he said, "I hate myself." It should have satisfied me. This was what I had been waiting for, wasn't it? For him to break. For him to feel the same despair I had once felt. But somehow, it didn't feel like enough. Because hating himself wasn't the same as paying for what he did. Not yet. A month later, I put the final phase of my plan into motion. I called Marcus into my office late one evening. He entered, looking wary, exhausted, and resigned all at once. I gestured for him to sit. "I have one last job for you." He stiffened slightly. "Another humiliation?" I chuckled. "Oh, this one's different." I pulled out a file and slid it across the desk. Marcus hesitated before picking it up. As he flipped through the pages, his face drained of color. "This," his voice cracked. "This is my old apartment." I nodded. "Yes, the one you stole from me." His throat bobbed as he swallowed. "What about it?" I leaned back, my smile sharp. "It's on the market, and I just bought it." Marcus's breath hitched. "I want you to go there," I continued. "And I want you to tell the current tenants they have a month to vacate." His hands trembled as he set the file down. "You want me to—" He stopped, his voice breaking. "You want me to do to them what I did to you." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The realization hit him like a physical blow. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his fingers digging into his palms. He shook his head. "No, I can't." I tilted my head. "Can't?" His voice was hoarse. "I won't." I let the silence stretch between us, watching him squirm. Then I said, "Then you're done." Marcus flinched. "No job. No place to stay. Nothing." I spread my hands. "You're free, Marcus. Free to go back to the streets. Free to start over. If you even can." He was shaking now, his entire body tense with panic. "Ethan, please." I stood. "You stole 6 years from me." My voice was quiet, but every word landed like a hammer. 6 years. I exhaled slowly. "Now it's your turn to start over." Tears welled in his eyes. He tried to say something, anything, but no words came. I walked past him, pausing at the door. This is the last time we'll ever speak. Then I left, and I didn't look back. I thought that would be the end of it. That I could walk away, leaving Marcus to rot in the same misery he had once condemned me to. That the wheel had turned full circle, and I could finally close this chapter of my life. But life isn't that simple. I didn't see Marcus again after that night. I didn't check if he was still in his dingy apartment, if he had found another way to crawl his way back up. It wasn't my problem anymore. At least, that's what I told myself. Weeks passed, then months. I buried myself in work, sealing deal after deal, climbing even higher. My name was gaining traction in the industry. Ethan Caldwell, the real estate mogul who came from nothing. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had become exactly the kind of man Marcus once was. The thought should have satisfied me, but it didn't. There was an emptiness where my anger used to be, a void that revenge hadn't filled. And then, one evening, something happened that shattered the illusion that I had won. It was a late November night, 6 years to the day since Marcus had thrown me out into the cold. I was leaving my office when I saw a figure slumped against the wall near the entrance. At first, I didn't recognize him. The man was thinner than I remembered, his clothes little more than rags, his face gaunt. His beard was overgrown, his hair matted. His hands, once well manicured, were cracked and raw from the cold. It was only when he turned his head slightly, and the street lamp caught his hollow eyes, that I realized who it was. Marcus. For a moment, I just stood there, frozen. He hadn't moved from where he sat, his arms wrapped around himself for warmth. There was no recognition in his expression, no spark of the arrogance that had once defined him. He was nothing now. Less than nothing. A part of me, the part that had spent years dreaming of this moment, wanted to laugh, to kneel beside him and whisper, "How does it feel, Marcus?" To revel in the justice of it all. But I didn't. Instead, I felt something else. Something I hadn't expected. Emptiness. Marcus had been my enemy for so long, the driving force behind everything I had done. But looking at him now, there was no satisfaction, no triumph, just a dull, aching sense of something I couldn't quite name. Maybe pity, maybe regret, or maybe just exhaustion. I exhaled slowly, reaching into my coat pocket. My fingers brushed against the smooth surface of my wallet, the weight of it suddenly feeling heavier than it should. Then, without a word, I pulled out $100 bill and dropped it onto the pavement beside him. His fingers twitched slightly, but he didn't reach for it. He didn't even lift his head. I stared at him for a long moment, waiting for something, anything, some sign that he still had fight left in him. But there was nothing, just a broken man who had once been my brother. I turned away, walking into the night. This time, I didn't look back. Days passed, then weeks. I told myself I was done with Marcus, that the final image of him, broken, lost, was all the closure I needed, that I had avenged my suffering, settled the score, and that there was nothing left to dwell on. But something gnawed at me, a quiet, persistent voice at the back of my mind. It wasn't guilt. Not exactly. I didn't regret what I had done. But I kept thinking about that night. How he hadn't reacted. How he hadn't even looked at me. It was as if he had already given up. And I wasn't sure why that unsettled me so much. I should have felt victorious. Instead, I just felt hollow. One evening, I found myself walking the same route home, past the place where I had last seen Marcus. It was bitterly cold, the kind of New York winter that clawed through even the thickest coats. I told myself I wasn't looking for him, that I was just passing through. But when I reached the alley where he had been, the space was empty. No Marcus. No sign he had ever been there. For reasons I couldn't explain, I felt a strange sense of unease. I hesitated, then made my way to the nearby shelter. It was one of the places I had relied on when I had nothing, years ago. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of unwashed clothes and weak coffee. People were huddled together on thin cots, wrapped in whatever blankets they could get. I approached the front desk, where an older woman in a worn sweater was sorting through paperwork. "Excuse me," I said. "I'm looking for someone." She glanced up, wary. I described Marcus, his name, his condition. Her brow furrowed. "We haven't seen him in over a week." A strange sensation tightened in my chest. I stepped back, nodding my thanks, and left. The city felt different that night. Colder. A week later, I found him. Not on the street, not in a shelter, but in the hospital. I don't know what made me check, Maybe it was a nagging instinct, or maybe just a desperate need to put an end to the unanswered questions. But when I inquired at a nearby clinic, they directed me to Bellevue Hospital. I found him in a shared room, hooked up to an IV, his face paler than I'd ever seen it. His hands were bandaged, his lips cracked. Hypothermia, malnutrition, dehydration. I stood in the doorway for a long time, watching him sleep. He was nothing like the man I once feared, the man who had destroyed me. And for the first time, I didn't see Marcus the villain. Just Marcus. The brother I had once loved. The brother who had once carried me on his shoulders when I was small. The brother who had betrayed me, yes, but also the brother who was now dying alone. And I didn't know what to do with that. I told myself I was just there to see, to confirm he was still breathing. Nothing more. That once I had my answer, I'd walk away, and that would be the end of it. But I didn't leave. I stood there, staring at him, trying to reconcile the man in the bed with the one who had once held my entire life in his hands and crushed it without a second thought. He looked so small. Marcus had always been larger than life, always the one in control, always sure of himself. Even when he threw me out, when he watched me beg, there had been no hesitation in him, just cold, calculated certainty. But now, lying there under harsh hospital lights, wrapped in thin sheets, he was just a man. A broken, fragile man. I hated him. I pitied him. I resented him. And yet, I found myself stepping inside the room, closing the door softly behind me. I pulled up a chair, sitting beside the bed. He didn't stir. His breath was shallow, his skin paper thin. I wasn't sure how long I sat there. Minutes, maybe hours. At some point, a nurse came in, checked his vitals, gave me a wary glance, but said nothing. And still, I stayed. Not because I forgave him, not because he deserved it, but because I needed answers. Because for 6 years, my life had been fueled by anger, by the need to rise above him, to prove I was better. And now that I had won, now that he had lost so completely, I didn't know what was left of me. So I waited. And when Marcus finally stirred, when his eyelids fluttered open and he turned his head, weak and dazed, his sunken eyes landing on me, I felt the shift, the turning of the wheel once more. He blinked, unfocused, his cracked lips parting. At first there was nothing, just a hazy confusion. Then, recognition, and something else. Something I had never seen in Marcus before. Shame. He swallowed, his throat working painfully, his fingers twitching against the sheets. His lips moved, forming a word that barely escaped as a whisper. Ethan. For the first time in years, my brother spoke my name, and I had no idea how to feel about it. I didn't respond right away. I just sat there, watching him, waiting for something, an apology, an excuse, a plea. But Marcus only stared at me, his sunken eyes flickering with something I couldn't name. Guilt? Regret? Or was it just the sheer shock of seeing me sitting at his bedside instead of leaving him to rot? I leaned back in the chair, crossing my arms. You look like hell. His throat bobbed as he swallowed. His lips parted, but no words came out. He looked like he wanted to say something, But either he was too weak, or he didn't know where to begin. For a long moment, silence stretched between us. I thought about all the things I could say. I could remind him of that cold night 6 years ago, when he stood in the doorway, watching me shiver on the street as he slammed the door shut. I could ask him if he ever thought about me after that, if he ever wondered what happened to the brother he left for dead. I could tell him how I clawed my way back, how I became everything he tried to take from me. But none of those words came, because for the first time in years, I wasn't sure what I wanted from him anymore. So I just exhaled and leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "How long have you been like this?" His fingers twitched against the blanket. "Don't know," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "A while. A while." I thought about the last time I had seen him, huddled in the street, too weak to even pick up the money I had left for him. Had he been on the verge of collapse even then? Had I walked away when he was already dying? A strange, unwanted pang settled in my chest. I pushed it down. They said, hypothermia, malnutrition. "You've really hit rock bottom, huh?" His lips twitched, something that might have been a bitter smile if he had the strength. "Guess so." I studied him. He looked so different from the brother I once knew, the man who had been untouchable, who had always been in control. Now he was nothing more than skin and bones, a shadow of himself. I should have felt satisfied. I had dreamed of this moment for years, seeing him suffer, seeing him beg, but there was no pleasure in it now. Just a strange, hollow feeling. "Why?" I asked finally. His brow furrowed slightly. "Why did you do it?" I clarified. "Back then. Why did you take everything from me?" His breath hitched. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if the weight of the question was too much for him, in his fragile state. I waited. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I was afraid." I frowned. "Afraid?" A weak nod. His fingers curled slightly, as if grasping at something invisible. "Afraid of losing. Afraid of not having enough. Afraid of ending up like—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "Like this." I sat back, stunned. Of all the things I expected him to say, fear had never been one of them. Marcus had always been the strong one, the confident one, the one who seemed untouchable. The idea that he had done what he did not out of greed, but out of fear, it threw me off balance. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to tell him that his fear had cost me everything, that his paranoia had turned me into nothing. But as I looked at him now, helpless, broken, I realized something. He had ended up exactly where he feared he would. The irony was almost poetic, and for the first time in years, I didn't hate him. I just felt tired. I ran a hand down my face and exhaled. "You always thought you were invincible, Marcus." His lips pressed together, but he didn't argue. I let the silence stretch between us before I finally spoke again. "I don't know why I'm here," I admitted. "I don't know if I want to help you, or if I just wanted to see if you made it this far." His eyes flickered with something. Understanding, maybe, or acceptance. "I don't expect you to help me," he murmured. "Not after everything." I studied him. And then I did something I never thought I would. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my wallet, and tossed a few bills onto the table beside his bed. Not just $100 this time. A stack thick enough to keep him off the streets for a while. Marcus stared at it, then at me. His lips parted slightly, but no words came. I stood. "Don't waste it." I turned to leave. But just as I reached the door, his voice, weak, strained, called after me. "Ethan." I stopped. A pause. A breath. Then, "Thank you." I didn't turn around. I just walked out, leaving him behind. And for the first time in years, the weight of the past didn't feel so heavy anymore. I didn't know what to expect after that day. I had given Marcus money, more than I ever thought I'd be willing to give him. But the words he had said, that simple thank you, lingered in my mind. It wasn't what I had imagined. It wasn't a confession, an apology, or a grand gesture of redemption. It was just gratitude. Quiet, unassuming gratitude from the man who had once crushed my life without a second thought. I tried to push it out of my mind. I told myself it didn't matter. It didn't change anything. But the more I thought about it, the more it gnawed at me. I had expected the confrontation, the anger, the demands. But what had I gotten instead? The truth. Or was it just the remnants of a broken man, grasping at whatever he could? Days passed. I returned to my life, my busy, successful life that had been built from nothing, forged through sweat and grit. I kept climbing the ladder of success, burying the past deeper with each new deal, each new investment. But something inside me was still restless. I found myself thinking about Marcus, about his fragile state, about the uncertainty in his eyes. Was it just pity that I felt? Or was it something else? I couldn't ignore the nagging question. What if he wasn't completely lost? What if there was a chance for him to rise again, to find something to hold on to? I shook the thought away. It was ridiculous. Still, every few days I would check in on him, not out of obligation, but because I couldn't help myself. And then, one day, I found myself back at Bellevue. This time, the hospital room was quieter. The buzz of machinery was faint, and there was a sense of finality in the air. I didn't even need to ask the nurse to know that something had changed. She met me with a somber expression as I stepped into the room. "He's not doing well," she said, her voice low. "His condition's deteriorated. He's not responding much anymore?" I nodded, my throat tightening. I walked into the room where Marcus lay still, his face pale, his eyes closed. The beeping of the monitor beside him seemed to echo louder than it should, filling the silence between us. I stood there for a long time, just watching him. The man who had been my brother, the man who had stolen my future, the man who had now become a ghost. I thought about all the years we had spent together as children. I thought about how, despite everything, there had always been a bond, something unspoken between us. And now it was gone. I reached into my pocket, my hand brushing against the money I had left for him. It felt small now, insignificant. What good was money in a place like this? What good was anything when the person you had once been closest to was slipping away? I didn't know what I expected, what I hoped for, but it wasn't this. I didn't know why I was here again, why I couldn't just let him go. A nurse entered the room, checking his vitals, her movements efficient and practiced. She glanced at me, then back at Marcus, her face hard to read. "Has he said anything?" I asked quietly, the words tasting strange in my mouth. She shook her head. "No, not for days." I glanced at the door, a part of me considering leaving. But as I turned to go, I heard a faint sound, a rasping breath. I stopped, turning back to Marcus. His eyelids fluttered, and for the briefest moment, his eyes cracked open. They weren't the same eyes from before. They were duller now, clouded with exhaustion and pain. But there was something else there, too. Something I couldn't place. "Ethan," he whispered, his voice so soft I almost didn't hear it. I stepped forward, leaning closer to him. He struggled to focus on me, his words slurring slightly. I'm sorry." My breath caught in my throat. "I was wrong. I didn't know what I was doing." He coughed weakly, wincing at the pain. "You didn't deserve any of it." The words came out in fits and starts, as if he had to fight to keep them from slipping away. I didn't know how to respond. My mind was a whirlwind, spinning with conflicting emotions. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him that sorry didn't fix anything, to remind him of all the years I had spent rebuilding myself, all the things I had lost because of him. But when I opened my mouth, no words came. Instead, I found myself staring at him, really staring. And something within me began to shift. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't closure. It was something more complicated, something raw and real, and too tangled to untangle all at once. For a moment there was just us, the two of us, lying in the same place we had been years ago. Only now, there was no power struggle, no more manipulation, no more competition. Only two people, scarred, damaged, and trying to survive in a world that didn't seem to care either way. I reached out then, unsure why, but my hand landed lightly on his. It was the smallest of gestures, but it was all I had left. And for the first time in years, I felt something resembling peace. It wasn't a happy ending, but it was an ending. And in that moment, it was enough. As I left the room, the quietness of the hospital hallway surrounding me, I knew one thing for certain. I had learned the hardest lesson of all. That sometimes, the wheel of fate didn't just spin for the people who deserved it. It spun for everyone. And none of us ever got out unscathed. Ethan's motivations had evolved. The initial fire for revenge that had burned within him, hot, uncontrollable, consuming, had cooled, tempered by time and experience.